I'm really glad you asked that question, because if we do see the gospel and see discipleship in a frame that is primarily transactional and instructional, like what are we meant to do? We have to do this. We have to make friends with this person and then share the gospel with them. Our sharing will be necessarily monological. It'll just be us talking in a monologue and waiting to have those moments.
Everybody's a project, right? That makes everybody a project.
It makes everybody a project. And if there's one thing people today, Christians and non-Christians, are very good at, it's sniffing out inauthenticity. No one wants to be a project. And you don't want to be that weird Christian that just, is making friends with people just to bring them to Jesus. And again, we can go back to scripture for this. We are never called anywhere to love people in order to lead them to Christ. We're just called to love them as an end in itself because they're made in God's image. The call to lead them to Christ is a separate command. Those commands exist separately. They do cross-fertilize each other practically in a beautiful way, but the minute we think the only reason we're loving people is so they can come to know Jesus, we're shortchanging who they are in God's image.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Disciple Dilemma. I'm Dennis Allen. What's a disciple supposed to think about the headlines? All the trauma, all the suffering, all the sorrow, the wars, the anguish that's going on. Well, today we've got someone with us, Max Jeganathan, who is with the Center for Public Christianity in Sydney, Australia, and the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, to talk about denial, despair, or discipleship. Max is going to cover a wide range of geopolitical issues and also talk to us very plainly about how the disciple of Christ is to follow Christ, to fear God, not circumstances. Let's listen as Max talks with us today about this important part of discipleship. Well, Max Jeganathan, who is a follower of Christ, he's a husband, he's a dad, he's also an attorney, he's been a political advisor to the Parliament in Australia, he's an apologist, and he's just a terrifically prescient guy when it comes to geopolitics. Thank you for being with us on the Disciple Dilemma.
Thanks so much for having me, Dennis, and for that kind introduction. Great to be with you.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about, and I promised everybody you'd be able to boil everything down to 30-second sound bites and solve all the world's problems. So could we start, Max, with a sense about geopolitics? A lot of our thought leaders and change leaders are pastors, elders, deacons, small group leaders, but they don't necessarily know what geopolitics is. How about a little primer for a moment or two?
Yeah, sure. There's plenty that could be said about geopolitics, and there are plenty of kind of sub-disciplines and tangentially relevant things that can be said too. But broadly speaking, geopolitics is really about communities of people, cultures of people, ultimately nations of people, and how nation states interact, how they find and secure their own sense of identity, their economic, their social, and their cultural interests, how they interact on the world stage, how they interact with each other in an economic context, in a financial context, in a military context, and broadly speaking, how they come together to do certain things with other like-minded nations that they agree with, and how they also come together to counter values and nations and civilizations that they don't agree with. And so it's a bit abstract and a bit blunt, but that's what geopolitics broadly is. It's about the geographic, cultural, and economic interactions, conflicts, and dynamics of world politics, and how countries think about themselves and interact with other countries.
So as a policy advisor, when I start grabbing some of the headlines and handing them to someone like you, who you have a career having worked with Parliament in Australia, right, and helping to advise them on policy. So for a lot of folks listening, I'm just going to grab some headlines. I'm going to set them up, and we're going to let Max just see if he can put a few chess pieces on the board and move them around.
Sure.
And think about, here's the question I want to ask first. I want to ask, as I set these headlines up, what do you think the average person on the street is thinking as they listen to these headlines popping up? And then I want to turn the conversation to the idea of how should a follower of Christ absorb, assimilate, and think about these same headlines.
Sure.
So we're going to throw this contest at Max. Let me just throw a few out there, Max. Let's think about some of the ones we would see in the headlines today. We would think about Sudan. We would think about Syria. We would think about Russia. We would think about Ukraine. We would think about the interpolitical dynamics of people like Australia, New Zealand, the US against China. What kind of typical responses are you seeing and hearing from the people you interact with, not believers, on headlines and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a really good set of questions and some kind of jarring and thought-provoking headlines too that just reflect some of the struggles and conflict that's happening at the moment. I would put it into three broad categories in terms of what the average person's thinking and what the follower of Christ can do and how they can make sense of it. The first would be I think we have to be realistic and practical here. People are very time poor these days. People are busy. They're paying their mortgages. They're trying to raise their kids. They're trying to look for work. They're trying to make the numbers add up at the end of the month, and because of that, the headlines can be quite discouraging and confusing. And so a lot of people, myself included, most of us who are not subject matter experts or who are doing this stuff 24/7, don't have a full understanding of the conflicts. So I think that's important to acknowledge right out of the gate, that we might see a headline and read a newspaper article, but there are a lot to these problems and these conflicts, usually not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years of history that have built up, a lot of cultural, religious, political, and economic moving foundations and feasts that have led to these conflicts. So the first thing I think is that people are just overwhelmed by the complexity of conflicts, and if they're intellectually humble enough, as I think it's healthy to be, they don't fully understand what's going on. They can't make sense of why these people can't just sort it out and work out their conflict. I think the second thing is that people are trying to work out how they make sense of them. So with what we do know about international conflicts and geopolitical conflicts, how do we make sense of that? How does that fit into my family, my life, my worldview, my system of thinking? Because there are so many loose ends. There are so many good guys and bad guys. People are trying to work out, which side am I on? Do I have to pick a side? There are things I like about this side, but then there are things I don't like about this side too. So there's a lot of, I think, people struggling to integrate it into their own life and into their own world. And I think it's incorrect to say about any of these sorts of conflicts and headlines that we can just remove ourselves, that nothing matters. Our world is so integrated and globalized now. Our cultural systems, the amount of people movements and migrations, our economic and financial system, it's all integrated. And the Russia-Ukraine war is a great example of how something happening thousands of miles away is very relevant. It's relevant to supply chains. It's relevant to, trade flows. It's relevant to, our domestic governments and how things work for us. The cost of our gas, the cost of our grain, the cost of our electricity. It's all affected. So we can't run away. But people are, secondly, trying to make sense of what it means for them. And then thirdly, and this is probably the most prevailing one, is that people are kind of despondent about the suffering in the world. People kind of throw their hands up in despair. And there's a combination, I think, of helplessness and confusion about not just the suffering we see through the headlines, but I think people naturally attach that to the suffering they see and are going through in their own lives too. And it becomes a bigger, broader question about human suffering, that the world is just, so messed up and spiraling into chaos, and there's so much division and uncertainty. And we see that, in our families, we see it in our streets, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and we see it between our nations as well. So I think it's a combination of those three things: people not fully understanding, not having all the information they need because they're not getting it in a clear and concise way, people trying to work out how to make sense of it, and people just struggling with the concept of the suffering within it as a broader issue that we all have with dealing with suffering.
When we think about that in the West, and I'm asking you sort of integrate, you're on the ground in a studio in the morning in Australia, and here I am on the ground in the evening in the Washington, D.C. area.
Right.
Well, the predominant issue on the table today in the American culture, according to people like Jonathan Haidt, the psychiatrist who speaks obviously about a lot of American social culture, is anxiousness is a rampant plague, far more potent today than COVID. How do you see it in Australia? Do you see the average person over there struggling with anxiousness as well, or is it not a big deal?
No, I think Haidt is right, and you are right to point that diagnosis at other culturally similar countries. Australia very much shares a lot of that, and I think you see it, and you see metrics of it across the OECD, across particularly in industrial advanced democracies, where there are the blessings of free speech, a free press, the free movement of capital, free markets. People, we have we are more academically, technologically, and educationally advanced than we've ever been before in human history. And yet the levels of anxiousness, anxiety, and the companions of those struggles, loneliness, social exclusion, uncertainty, relational breakdowns, all of those things are all where they've always been. So there seems to be a lack of being able to break the struggles of humankind with what we have defined as the success metrics of humankind. We thought if we would just work harder and get richer, we could kind of think and innovate and science our way out of our problems. And yet we continue to struggle with the deeper existential things. The anxiety is still there. There's an interesting statistic, I think, that across OECD countries, the higher the GDP per capita, so the higher the private wealth of a country, the greater the need for psychologists and psychiatrists per square mile. And that's like a direct correlation. And so that kind of shows that the anxiety and the anxiousness that's out there doesn't go away when you get rich.
Max, so you're throwing a lot of curveballs at us with this conversation. How about grouping it back up in a moment for the rational actor on the street? I think your phrase oftentimes is VUCA. Would you explain VUCA?
Yes, and I should disclaimer that it's certainly not my phrase. It's something that comes up usually in leadership theory, economic theory, and amongst futurists and cultural commentators. And it's a way of talking about, VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And people are talking, and COVID was a big catalyst for this, that the world is more VUCA than it's ever been before. It's more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous than ever before. And it's easy to look at that and think that we are unique, or that we're in a unique position, or that these kinds of things have never had to be dealt with by a previous generation. And to a degree, that is the case because, the artificial intelligence revolution, for example, is unfolding in a way that we haven't gone through before. The Russia-Ukraine war represents a clash of, civilizational ideologies that hasn't happened in this way before. But that being said, when you look back through history, I think if we're honest about it, the world's always been VUCA. It's always volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It just, the VUCA just takes different forms and in different waves. We've had recessions, we've had inflation, we've had cost of living spikes, we've had tender financial markets, we've had banking instability and uncertainty, we've had new technology, we've had East versus West before, we've had, liberal and democratic values up against totalitarian values before. And, Malcolm Muggeridge, the British journalist, said that history is just the same stuff happening again and again to different people, right? And so we are the different people right now. But the VUCA-ness of our world, I think, is very difficult to argue against. I think that's broadly accepted, that however much more it might have been or less in the past, it's certainly VUCA today. It is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous.
So if I'm a rational actor and I am not of Christ, it would be absolutely rational, normal, natural that this should be a very anxious, despairing, frightening world that we live in, right?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the best you could do is grit your teeth and try and get resilient and use in a very rational, detached way whatever data we have from the past to predict what's going to happen. And the problem with prediction, and this is why being a rational actor without a moral framework, being a rational actor without a metaphysical base is not just tricky, but it's impractical, is because all prediction is based on data that comes from the past, because all data by definition comes from the past. It's all we have. And the problem with a VUCA world is that what's going to happen is unpredictable. There are more and more of these black swans. And so what that begins to uncover very clearly is that we need more than rationality. We need more than rationalism. It's not that we need to become irrational somehow or change our rationality, but rationality alone is not enough to navigate storms that you can't predict. You need a more solid existential foundation. You need moral frameworks. You need metaphysical bases through which to pump your rational thinking and rational acting. And I've often thought of a metaphor that hopefully is helpful, that rationality, reason, rationalism, these are all not in and of themselves bad things, but they're like an engine. They're like an internal combustion engine. They still need petrol to be pumped through it to work. Doesn't matter how good the engine is, you still need petrol. You still need petrol. And in my view, and according to the Christian worldview, that petrol is metaphysical. It's moral. It's existential. It has to come from beyond ourselves. We can't work that out, with science and tech and AI and wealth accumulation and whatever it is. So we need metaphysical, moral petrol to pump through this engine. Civilizations with a Judeo-Christian heritage, for all the bad and the mistakes that they have made, that we have made, still maintain that anchoring and that centrality of those ideals, those metaphysical ideals. Whether we deny them or not, they're still there. These commitments to intrinsic human dignity, to equality, to justice, to freedom. Those are, the ideals that have made the modern world. And so any attempt now to run away from them or to trash them or to cut off their source is a dangerous one, an unnecessary one, and ultimately a stupid one.
I've been traveling the northeastern U.S. and the southern U.S., getting ready to head west. And the thing that I'm hearing over and over again from university presidents on Christian campuses, seminary presidents on seminary campuses, is our counseling load and our counseling requirements have gone through the roof among the believers. I think we bought into the cultural narrative rather than into the Christ narrative. That's where I'm going with this.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And that sadly doesn't surprise me. There's an Australian pastor who put it really well. And I don't think the us and them typology is particularly helpful or constructive, but I think there are aspects of this discussion where us and them does make sense, because there is a Christian narrative, a Christian community, and a model of Christian discipleship. And then there is a necessarily both unchristian and anti-Christian version of all of those things too, that we see aspects of in the secular world. And this pastor said, in the church, we're not being out-thought, we're being out-discipled. Out there, they're discipling. Secularism is discipling people better than we're discipling people. And I think that is quite key. The prevalence we see of followers of Jesus, people struggling with their faith, wrestling with their faith, trying to hold on to their faith in the midst of a turbulent world, it's because of a lot of things. But I think one of the big things it's because of is that we need to do better as a kingdom, the kingdom of God, as Christ's church. We need to do better at encouraging and equipping and emboldening people with the intellectual and spiritual horsepower they need to know that this message of Jesus, this gospel, is integrated and it's integrative. There's nothing out there in the world that this message can't help us make sense of and prepare us for and strengthen us to navigate through. And that requires cross-disciplinary thinking. It requires expertise from various sectors, and it requires, a deep understanding of scripture that we can then apply to the world. We need to do better at taking the newspaper and reading it through the lens of scripture, and not siloing those things off. And so I think it's incumbent on a lot of people from various aspects of Christian life and public theology, and the church itself too, to do better at helping people make sense of the big questions and big issues of the day through the Christian lens. There has to be, on Sunday mornings and in midweek small groups, there has to be talk of Russia, Ukraine. There has to be talk of inflation. There has to be talk of economic dynamics and financial market volatility. These are the big issues that people are dealing with. And if the gospel is just centered around exegeting a parable or exegeting a verse without landing it in the lap of a Goldman Sachs trader when he goes to work on Monday, or the derivatives consultant from JP Morgan when he goes to work on Tuesday, if those two things aren't connected, then we will continue to be out-discipled. This message of Jesus is a holistic message that applies to everything. It's a way of seeing the world and of being in the world. It's not just how we are called to think about a few different aspects of morality and rules to follow. It's much more holistic than that. So I think that the need to present the gospel as something that can shed light on and insight on everything is what we need to do more of.
So Max, this is a point that I think is worth bringing up for a minute. A lot of people will look at you and they'll look at pastors and they'll look at professors and they'll go, well, you guys have memorized the apologetics encyclopedia. You guys got all these really catchy answers. It's really cool, right? But the rest of us are just normal blokes wandering through life. And come on, when the really complex stuff starts, we're looking to you guys to have the answers, you guys to have the TED Talks. What do you want from us when you keep on saying you want us to be able to sort of be helped by this? You don't really expect me to learn this stuff, do you?
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's fair as a question, and as an analysis of the challenge out there. The first thing I'd say is let's be really clear. I certainly don't have all of the answers, and no one, has all of the answers. As a kingdom, all of the answers are there. We have them kind of together as a team, but even then, we don't have knocked down 100% answers to everything. What we do have is a compelling response. We have an insightful and we have the capacity in the Christian message for an insightful and compelling response to every issue. It doesn't have to be a deductive or a knockdown answer. All we have to do is to be more confident and proactive in equipping ourselves and preparing ourselves to be able to constructively engage on these issues. We don't need all of the answers, and in any given dinner party or cocktail party or Twitter exchange, you're very rarely going to completely win an argument. But the beauty of the Christian message is we're not trying to win arguments. We're trying to win people. We don't need to win one argument. We don't need to bring any discussion or debate to a final conclusion where we win. What we are trying to do is reflect the explanatory power and the transformative beauty of the gospel message and a relationship with Jesus. That's what we're trying to do. So we don't all need all the answers, but what we can do and should do, and this is why the two most important things about biblical apologetics is not giving answers and winning debates and achieving things by the pure force of logic and reason. It starts in 1 Peter 3:15 with first set aside Christ as Lord in your heart. That's actually the most important thing about public engagement and biblical apologetics is Jesus actually the Lord in your heart first? And are you investing in that relationship? That's the most important thing. And then the third component of that verse is do it with gentleness and respect. So how we are and who we are is much more important than what we say. The middle component is be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. That's important, but not as important as the first and the third. That's why Peter starts with make sure that you're walking with Jesus well first. Make sure that you're investing in your relationship with him first. That's more important than reading apologetics books. Grow closer to him. That's kind of the ball game. Then you'll be able to engage with gentleness and respect, and the reasons will come. The other important part of that second component of that verse, which is kind of the anchor verse for biblical apologetics, is always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. We're not called to all be economic and geopolitical commentators. What we are called to be able to do is give an account of why we're Christian. Why are we walking with Jesus? What does this mean to us? And the most powerful apologetic that any one of us has is our own story and our own walk. The beautiful layer that comes on top of that is our professional vocation and expertise and interests. And so for the economist, God has already kind of tailored you and built you to pump the message of Jesus through the concepts of economics. For the painter, through that. For the banker, through that. For the educator, for the businessman, through that. And that's why, Acts 17 is so instructive, I think, for the 21st century. Paul goes to Athens and he communicates the gospel first in the Jewish synagogue through their scriptures. Then he goes to the marketplace, communicates it through the concept of the marketplace. Then he goes to the university, the Areopagus, and gives a TED talk, and he communicates it through the Greek and Roman philosophers. Everywhere he goes, it's the same gospel, but he's using the expertise he has to bring it to those places. The beauty of the free market and where any of us work is that we already have expertise in that space. And so all we need to do is be confident and comfortable in communicating the message of Jesus through what we are already doing in our lives.
Folks, you're on the Disciple Dilemma, and we're talking with Max Jeganathan, who is an apologist, as you can tell. He's also an attorney. He's been a policy advisor in Parliament for Australia. He is a follower of Christ. He is a husband. He's a dad, and he's a terrific coach when it comes to talking about Christ. When we come back, we're going to talk a little more with Max about how all this idea of geopolitics and gracious answers as an apologist fits together for you and for me. Rubber meets the road. It's no longer in Max's court. It's in our court. Stay with us. Max, I got a problem. Here's my problem, right? It is that if I wander around the United States right now, if I wander around Canada, even if I traipse into Mexico with these conversations, the statistics that the research houses are piling up on us about the state of discipleship says that 90% of the people in the pews do not feel equipped, nor do they feel it their job to be able to give a reason for the hope. They say it's your problem and it's the pastor's problem. 80% of the people in the pews in the States say, I have no prayer life, I have no fellowship, and I attend church maybe 1.7 times a month. 40% of the people in the United States today say, I'm not even really sure if Jesus is the only way to Christ. And then that brings us to a group that used to be in the church and is no longer in the church. If I look at the millennial and the Gen Z group, so you think about folks
Right.
roughly today in the age ranges of 18 up to about 48 today, 60% of those who were raised in the church have already left the church and they're not coming back. When my generation left the church, I had kids, I came back. The generation of the millennials, not coming back with kids. The Gen Zs mostly haven't had kids yet, but they're walking off at a pretty rapid rate. All this sews together to say, I think we have a problem with discipleship in the West. I think we have a problem understanding who we are. I think we have a problem with identity, with purpose, with meaning, with belonging. We have a big problem. So my question to you is, would you just walk me through this idea of, I want Max to have the answers. I don't need the answers. You brought up just a minute ago this statement, and I want our folks to hear this. Every single one of us who is not up on stage giving a TED talk owes not only Christ as Lord, but relationships with people so we can start talking about things we may not even have the answers to yet. Would you kind of take that ball and run with it a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you raised this, Dennis, because this, I think, is at the heart of the problem that we have, not just in North America. Those statistics are jarring, but sadly not surprising to me. I think this is across advanced industrial countries, the church is struggling with this. I think a lot of it comes from fear and anxiety and anxiousness. And so when you are scared, as I am still from time to time, and I was for a long time when I started my walk with Jesus, you try to find reasons why it's not your problem, why you shouldn't have to do it. Now, very clearly, we can look at Scripture and we see pretty quickly, even though it's confronting, that we just can't get out. That escape hatch, that get out of jail free card is not there. We are all called to be ready to set aside Christ as Lord in our heart, to be ready to give a reason for the hope that we have, and to do so with gentleness and respect. And then Jesus makes it very clear. The Great Commission calls us to go and make disciples of all nations. What that means is, if we want to take the Bible seriously, if you don't want to take the Bible seriously, this is not a problem. But if you want to take the Bible seriously and walk with Jesus, one thing is clear. All followers of Jesus are evangelists and apologists. We don't get a choice. The only option we have is whether or not we're a committed evangelist and apologist, or we're not. We can't carve that out any more that we can say, look, with the fruits of the Spirit, I'm good on all of them except for self-control and gentleness. I'm just not going to do those. That's just not me. That doesn't come naturally to me. There are other people in my church better at that. Evangelism and apologetics is like that. Yeah, there are always people that, the Lord will call out to do things full-time, or to do things, structurally, strategically, professionally on a stage with a microphone. But that is not the biblical model of evangelism and apologetics. That's not how God grows his kingdom. He grows his kingdom by his followers living out in truth, in love, in compassion, in joy, in patience, living out the gospel message and reflecting him in the lives of those around them. That's how people will come. That's how good evangelism is done. And it kind of leads me to my next point, which is that the crux of the challenge in encouraging and equipping the church in the 21st century is around maybe shifting our focus. It's not reconstructing the gospel, it's shifting our emphasis. For too long, this gospel has been talked about as an instructional and a transactional gospel. He's an angry God, and we've got to do this, this, and this, otherwise he's going to stay angry. And this are the things that we have to do. Christianity for far too long has been talked about as a set of rules to follow. Whereas when you look at it, it's not. When you look at the scriptures, it's not instructional, and it's not transactional. It's certainly not at first instance. It's relational and it's conversational. So we need to shift that emphasis, I think. This is a relational, conversational gospel. We know that because when Jesus is asked, effectively, what's the meaning of life? He's asked, what's the greatest commandment? He's asked in a very transactional and instructional frame. And in his answer, he basically says, hey, it's not about instructions and commands. Go and love God and love other people. He answers with two relationships. So he deconstructs the question. We are always looking for what we need to do to get somewhere. He says, no, it's not what you need to do. There are two categories of relationship I want you to go and invest in. Invest in your relationship with God and invest in your relationships with the people around you. That's all you got to do. That's the meaning of life. Like, that's it. I don't know why we're writing so many books on the meaning of life. It's right there. You know, there are around 2.4 billion Christians today. If each of us just journeyed with someone and they ended up becoming Christian in the next 25 years, we'd go from 2.4 billion to 4.8 in one generation. There's never been a revival like that.
I want to circle back to something that you've been saying, and I want to make sure our folks can see it and hear it coming from you, because when I've spent time with you, fondly thinking back about our days over in Oxford together, listening to you talk, one of the things that you bring up over and over again is you've got to understand the other person before you start trying to deliver your message on your side of the fence. I think Western Christianity fears the idea of evangelism and fears the identity of the idea of talking about Christ, because we think, well, Max gets up on stage, he's got complex sentences, he's got a well-rehearsed, very polished delivery, he gets stuff and he gets people, and there's no need on stage. This is not true, but the idea is there's no need on stage to understand people. Would you talk for just a minute about the idea that you have thrown at me and other folks as we listen to you talk about understanding people before you try to deliver your truth and your wisdom to them?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because if we do see the gospel and see discipleship in a frame that is primarily transactional and instructional, like, what are we meant to do? We have to do this. We have to make friends with this person and then share the gospel with them. Our sharing will be necessarily monological. It'll just be us talking in a monologue and waiting to have those moments.
Everybody's a project, right? That makes everybody a project.
It makes everybody a project. And if there's one thing people today, Christians and non-Christians, are very good at, it's sniffing out inauthenticity. No one wants to be a project. And you don't want to be that weird Christian that just, you know, is making friends with people just to bring them to Jesus. And again, we can go back to scripture for this. We are never called anywhere to love people in order to lead them to Christ. We're just called to love them as an end in itself because they're made in God's image. The call to lead them to Christ is a separate command. Those commands exist separately. They do cross-fertilize each other practically in a beautiful way, but the minute we think the only reason we're loving people is so they can come to know Jesus, we're shortchanging who they are in God's image. And we're putting way too much pressure on the gift of evangelism. We're treating evangelism like a project rather than a gift.
So Max is disassembling, he's deconstructing right now one of the most favored security blankets in passive Christianity, which is, you expect me to be up on a soapbox with a bullhorn, with a whole bunch of answers. And Max is saying, walk alongside people, get to know them, and watch your love for them, not as a project, but as Christ's agape flowing out of you to other people. Watch them start asking you questions. Max is taking away some of the sacred ground of the insecurity of being a person who is an apologia for Christ. This is great,
Absolutely.
Max.
Absolutely.
But now you got to pivot for us and take us into another spot, right? Which is, in America today, in the American Christian community, if we take a look at some of these headlines, I'm going back to some of the things we said a little bit earlier. You were talking about fear is a big issue. Anxiety is a big issue in cultures today. In America, I freaking do not want you messing with my political systems, because that's the only hope we've got for America if we are true Christians in America, and this is the way we believe it's going to be. And, by the way, identity and gender and climate change and wars and interest rates and, oh my gosh, the Fed just jacked us by another 25 basis points today. Max, come on, man. As Christians, we deserve to be nervous about this stuff, right? Because if we don't work really hard, Jesus's kingdom could collapse, right, brother?
Right. Yeah. Hey, our Reserve Bank just jacked us 25 points as well yesterday. So we're with you. We're feeling that pain. And I totally hear you, you know. I mean, that there is no hyperbole in what you have said. All of that is completely spot on. And we are I think we are not right to be freaked out, but it's completely understandable that we are freaked out. Like I am unsettled. I look around. There is anything but stability out there. You know, on John F. Kennedy's desk when he was president, he had a little plaque that said, "The sea is so big and my boat is so small." And it feels like that. And not only is the sea big, it's really stormy at the moment. It's really stormy. And so I understand that. But it's important to remember that when Jesus calmed the storm at the beginning of Mark's gospel, he calms it first and then he turns to his disciples and he kind of says, "Hey, why are you guys scared now? And why were you scared in the first place? Like, why'd you wake me up?" What that points to is an important aspect of the Christian promise and Christian discipleship. It's that the Christian journey is not about calming the storm. We do have a God who can calm the storm. He can do whatever he likes, but he's not willing to let us define what storms are and to let us define what calm is. And we know that he doesn't calm all of the storms because Christians everywhere and non-Christians are going through storms constantly, always, right? And these storms are coming and they're real. The fact that Jesus says, "Why were you so afraid?" implies that what he is saying is, with me in your boat, you should have been calm in the midst of the storm. You should have been calm the whole time. And so what he's saying is these storms are going to come and we are not exempt from them. And nowhere does the Bible say, you know, if you walk with Jesus, there's going to be no suffering or there are going to be no storms or everything's going to be easy. The Bible never promises that life will be easy. It promises that it will be amazing through the suffering, not in spite of it. And so when all of these storms come, we do need to use all the resources that we've got and the expertise that we've got to get through it as best we can, to get our families through it as best we can. We need to invest wisely and manage our money and manage our education and do all of those things. But there is a degree to which we can always remain calm in the midst of the storm because of our relationship with the God who's God over the storm. And that's the beauty of that plaque, is that it's actually taken from a prayer. And it was given to JFK in the middle of the Cold War by one of his Navy admirals who picked it up in France. And so it's an old French prayer from the French region of Brittany. And the prayer is not, "The sea is so big and my boat is so small." The prayer is, "Oh God, your sea is so big and my boat is so small." And once we acknowledge that it's his sea, we don't need to grasp for our own means of salvation out of the storm. And a big one for Christians, not just in America, but all over the world, is politics. We think politics is the kingdom metric of success. As if Jesus, when he comes back, is going to say, "Show me your laws, show me your legislation, show me your constitution." He's not going to say that. He's going to say, "Show me your hearts." That's all he's going to say. That's all he's interested in. And so the metrics of success for the kingdom of God are not to have our laws in a certain way, not to have our politics in a certain way, not to be voting the right way or joining the right party. Those are all secondarily relevant for the Christian life. But what's much more important is to remember that the kingdom of God is about an invasion of hearts and minds, not an invasion of laws and statutes. It's about hearts and minds. And politics is just the wrong metric. And we often make the same mistake that Jesus' disciples make. They thought he was going to bring revolution and overthrow the Romans through a political revolution, through politics. And Jesus doesn't say that politics is irrelevant. He says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's." So he qualitatively separates them. He's not saying there shouldn't be any interaction. I think having Christians in politics is a really important thing. I think we should have Christians in both parties. I think we should have Christians in both major parties on both sides of most issues. I think we should be arguing, we should be debating, and I think there are solid theological positions to take on most issues on both sides of them. There's only a very few issues where there is a clear Christian position to take. And so I think we need to be perceptive to that.
Max is deconstructing a second piece of the puzzle for us right now, which is the concept of displaced and misplaced fear. So let me set a piece up here, Max, and then you can take a swat at the ball too. In the Christian community, I think we have lost largely what the idea is behind fear. The original concept, if we take it back to the Hebrew and bring it even through the Greek, the idea is not someone who's frightened and running away and screaming and crying. The idea is what is causing you to be awestruck?
Breaking down fear in the way you just did, Dennis, is hugely helpful and hugely relevant, for a politics guy, for a business guy, for any guy on the street, is hugely relevant and important. The Bible is very clear again and again and again. it takes that particular definition of fear, like being scared of something, like a frightened aversion to something, and it just says again and again, don't do it. Do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. You hear it from God through both testaments, through the apostles, before Jesus and after Jesus and from Jesus himself. Do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. The only thing that we are told to fear and encouraged to fear, as you correctly say, is God. And in that context, it's a completely different definition of fear. It's the one you started with when you framed your question. So the scary kind of fear is something that Christians are told just not to do. We are commanded not to fear. So there's no reason to fear. God wouldn't command it unless there was no reason to. So God says, don't fear in that way. Fear in this way, and even in this way, only fear me. And that is the kind of fear that is better defined as reverent awe, right? It's that acknowledgement of the awesomeness of something. And so God's basically saying, whatever fear you've got of things out there in the world, first of all, that's unchristian. Like if you're scared of this political party or this movement or this social movement or this view, if you're fearing any of that, then that's an unchristian move. Like we have to negotiate and deal and navigate through things and dialogue with people, but we don't have to fear. And then secondly, he says, I want you to take that fear, demolish it, then redefine it and point it at me in the context of reverent awe, not to be scared of, because the more commonly understood version of fear is what you run away from, whereas the version of fear God calls us to feel for him is actually something you run to. It's an attractive fear. And the lexical range has changed of that word, which is why it's probably not the most helpful word when people say fear God. People think we should be scared of God, and that feeds the instructional and transactional paradigm of the gospel, which is hugely problematic. Whereas really what God's saying is, come to me. When he says fear me, he says, be aware of my awesomeness and revere and worship and attract yourself to me. That's what he's saying. Be aware of the characteristics, the aspects of me that are attractive. So that reverent awe is how we should be relating to God. There's nothing to be scared of. That's a summary of my answering your question and everything the Bible says. There's nothing to be scared of. There is someone to reverently awe and love and worship and wonder at, and that's God himself. But there's actually nothing to be scared of.
I love the way that we're batting this one back and forth for a few minutes because, folks, if you're not picking up on this conversation this way, let me throw this out for you to consider. Max is suggesting, and I'm wholeheartedly endorsing, we've got to change our muscle memory. Our muscle memory is towards servile, cringing fear, which is idolatry. Now, it's awfully easy to say, well, you two guys in a podcast studio are sitting around having this little philosophical conversation, and we've got real life to deal with, right? We got to pay the bills. We don't know if a nuclear bomb is going to blow up in our territory. We don't know if our jobs are going to be lost. We don't know if our kids are going to be kidnapped. We just don't know. So this is a really scary world. However, for the follower of Christ, what I'm hearing from Max over and over again is, you are a disciple, you are a follower of Christ. Your reverence, your muscle memory, your DNA is to be trained toward the complete reverence of the Lord such that it eclipses the servile, cringing fear of day-to-day trauma in life. Now, look, Max is not saying, and I'm not saying, if we step out in the street and suddenly there are headlights and we see a big bus coming towards us, we don't, get very tense and jump out of the way, right? That's life. We're supposed to react and deal with that. But Max, I'm really interested in the wrap up here, since you've already destroyed the favorite excuse of I don't have to be an evangelist. I don't have to go around having an answer. I don't have to be anything other than afraid of life. I'm supposed to be afraid of life, man. You're wrecking all this stuff. Right. I'd like for you to talk for a couple of minutes about, if I can't find my meaning and my purpose in the things I'm afraid of, and waiting for guys like you to give the speeches, where do I find meaning and purpose and repentance and hope and redemption? Where do I find that stuff, man? As a believer, I'd like you to have that conversation with me. Practically, just how do I get my muscle memory into what you're talking about?
Yeah, this is good that this is the wrap up, because we do have to land this, right? Otherwise it can seem so abstract and irrelevant to people and philosophical that doesn't make sense, in practical life. So I agree with the question for what that's worth. Just to start by saying, when I say there's nothing to be scared of, that doesn't mean we're not called to be responsive. And with that will come emotions, and the getting out of the way of a bus that's coming for you is a perfect example. In that moment, it's a deeply Christian/human thing to do, to jump out of the way of the bus. So that's just being responsive to a situation. When I say there's nothing to be scared of, what I'm saying is there's nothing out there that we can't navigate through without the relationship with Jesus that we have been offered and invited into. So when you correctly say that relationship and that love and that power of God that we all are invited to have access to eclipses the trauma in our life. It doesn't exempt us from the trauma in our life. It does eclipse it, though. It's something we hold on to while walking through it. That's why, that passage of Psalm 23 is so powerful, right? I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and I fear no evil because you are with me. So the absence of fear is not because of the absence of the struggle or the uncertainty or the trauma or the suffering. The absence of fear is because God's with us. He's like, I'm walking with you through this. I'm not saying there's no shadow of death, there's no valley. There's a valley, but we're going to go through it together. And trust me, I've got this because I have performed for you the greatest response to human suffering in human history, which is the cross of Jesus Christ. I get your suffering and fear so much that I stepped down into it and took it all upon myself and died for you and rose for you. Now, because of that, you get three things. You get comfort and strength in the suffering, and you get hope of a future beyond the suffering and the struggle and the uncertainty and the fear. But you got to walk with me closely. And that's why it's so important that in that psalm, it says the valley of the shadow of death. And as a theologian once rhetorically wrote, would you rather be hit by a truck or the shadow of a truck? Right? So it's not that there's no suffering and no struggle, but it's all a shadow. It's all a shadow. It can still feel dark, and it is dark, and it's a struggle, but it's just a shadow of it. Jesus, by his cross, has relativized the suffering. Therefore, he also can relativize the fear. So how do we take that for ourselves and apply it in our lives? We do it by doing those exact two things that Jesus called us to do, by investing in our relationship with him and investing in our relationships with other people. As you see someone, and I've seen it in many people in my life, my mentors, I see it in my wife, my parents, as people grow deeper in their relationship with Jesus, they fear less. They fear less and they become fearless. But it doesn't mean there aren't things in their lives that they struggle with, and there aren't sufferings and uncertainties, but they navigate them in a much bolder and more responsive and far more resilient way. And that's because they know they've got Jesus in the boat. They know our boats are small and the sea is big, but it's God's sea and he's in my boat as well. And that's why the power of that story and that historical account is that God is making us two promises. He's saying, if you walk closely with me, and you've got to walk closely with me. So there is this, it's not a transactional aspect. It's actually just a payoff for the relational aspect of the gospel. When you're walking closely with me and loving people well, one of two things will always happen. I will either calm the storm. So he does promise to do that sometimes. Or I will calm you in the midst of the storm. He promises to do one of those two things, or both of them. But he can't do that if we're not walking with him closely. And that's on us. Everything we do in life is a response to his invitation to walk closely with him. And so whether it's at the geopolitical level or the national level or the state, the urban, the community level, or in our own homes or in our own lives, the dynamics are the same. Dealing with issues and struggles and uncertainties and black swans and volatility at all levels requires us, if we're going to do it best, according to the Christian message and the Christian story, to invest in our relationship with God first and invest in our relationships with the people around us. Everything else will fall into place.
What a beautiful wrap up to a conversation about how disciples should be thinking about the geopolitical realities of the world, about fear, and about having a reason, an answer for the reason for the hope that's within us all. 1 Peter 3:15, great counsel there. Max, as this is coming up on the screen, tell people how we can get in touch, find out more, listen, and see more of this wonderful Max who's out there on the social world talking about the gospel of Christ and the answers and the reason for the hope.
That's very kind. Thank you. If you want to know a bit more about me and what I've been doing, I'm with the Centre for Public Christianity in Sydney, Australia. You can check us out on Instagram. The handle is @publicchristhianity or @pre-maxjeg. That's me, PRIMAXJEG. I'm also doing a bit of speaking for the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, so you can look us up online too. And we'd love to have you join, subscribe, follow if you've enjoyed what you've heard, or if you have more questions, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Max, for being with us. God bless you and what you're doing, and it's always just a delight. I'm just saying this selfishly to get to see you close up. Thanks for what you do for Christ.
My pleasure, Dennis. Thank you. Keep doing what you're doing, and God bless you, brother.
Help us get the word out about discipleship, that Western discipleship has been hacked. Like some of the things we talked about today with Max Jeganathan. You can find us at www.thediscipledelima.com. We're also on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Rumbly, LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love for you to like and follow us. And as always, folks, thanks for listening.